Look, as I said last night, our Prime Minister has now, rightly or wrongly, several massive challenges on his hands. Much has been made of the comment by the French President, Macron, calling the Australian Prime Minister a liar. Remember, Macron was asked if he thought Scott Morrison had lied to him, and Macron replied, "I don't think, I know." Now, it's not just Macron the Prime Minister has to deal with, because that was Monday. 2 days earlier, sleepy Joe Biden got in on the act saying that America hadn't intended to blindside France when it agreed to the AUKUS submarine deal. And then Biden said, quote, "Oh, I was under the impression certain things had happened that had not happened. I was under the impression that France had been informed long before that the deal was not going through. I, honest to God, did not know that you had not been informed." Biden was probably asleep at the time, and at the best of times his so-called impressions would be chaotic. But Biden is backing Macron, both believing the Australian Prime Minister has misled them. It's not a matter of whether we believe them or not, and I'll come to that in a moment. The fact is, two of the world's leaders have accused the Australian Prime Minister of, at best, deceptive conduct, at worst, lying on the international stage. Now, Peter Jennings from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute understands better than most the nuances of all of this, and he argues correctly, quote, "It's stretching credulity to think the French were not aware of significant concerns the government had over the contract. Several months before the AUKUS announcement, Morrison had asked his officials for a plan B. It was all over the newspapers." Pardon me. You see, Macron also has a presidential election coming up, and he's been on the nose in France for some time. So he's making a big play about a multi-million-dollar submarine contract coming to France. In fact, way back in 2016, Macron announced that 4,000 people would be working on the project in France. Mind you, Turnbull is saying something similar to the Australian electorate. And remember, this contract was not with the French government, but with an outfit called the French Naval Group. And admittedly, it is a company part owned by the French government and part owned by the French arms company, Thales. But this wasn't a government-to-government deal. You may remember I told you last month that on or around, as recently as September 20, the CEO of this naval group, which was to make 12 diesel-powered submarines for Australia, had said that Canberra had sent a letter saying it was happy to proceed with the deal on the same day the contract was cancelled. Turnbull, as Prime Minister, got us into this mess. Now he's saying that Scott Morrison is leaking to the media text messages with Macron. Totally unworthy behaviour again by Turnbull. But how can anyone take anything Biden says seriously? As Peter Jennings implies, you wouldn't know what Biden had been told by his own officials because there's no guarantee that Biden would remember anything that he'd been told. So for Biden to say, "I was under the impression that certain things had happened that hadn't happened," and take the side of Macron, making serious accusations against the Australian Prime Minister, which go worldwide, is a bad look for our Prime Minister and Australia. Now, the always clear-thinking Tony Abbott has been in Washington. He made the simple point that we should consider retiring nuclear-powered submarines from either America or Britain for training purposes and as an insurance in the event of a conflict in the region. As Tony Abbott points out, the proposed nuclear fleet at best may not be operational until the 2040s, and that's a stretch. But as Greg Sheridan has pointed out, it's unlikely Australia will ever get a nuclear submarine. I mentioned last night the observations of the very well-informed Greg Sheridan when he said to me on this program, quote, "In the history of human habitation of this continent, nothing remotely comparable in complexity to building a nuclear submarine has ever been attempted. It makes no industrial or military sense to build the subs in Adelaide." Now, experts say if we were to design a new nuclear submarine just for Australia, we wouldn't get the first boat before 2060. Now, it's not just the denigrating remarks of Macron and Biden that would be worrying Scott Morrison. Tony Abbott is right in saying that there are submarines that are being retired from the Royal Navy, LA class, buy one or two, put them under an Australian flag to be, quote, "an addition to the order of battle in the Western Pacific, should that be necessary," unquote. Now, you will recall Tony Abbott made a speech recently in Taiwan. He does his own homework. He warned that Beijing could, quote, "lash out disastrously very soon." And with China's growing assertiveness, quote, "the challenges are pressing, the perils are not far off," Tony Abbott. He's saying that the purchase of these older model nuclear submarines is critical because national security experts are now telling us, and here is the next Morrison worry, which I've alluded to many times before, we don't have the expertise or the industry to maintain a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. Michael Shoebridge, the Director of the Defence and National Security Program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, has welcomed Tony Abbott's suggestion, warning, quote, "We need people who are experienced in the safe operating of the boats themselves, and we need to create the onshore infrastructure to enable that," unquote. Well, we don't have either. So it's one thing to say we'll build submarines down the track when we may not have the knowledge at home to operate them. The reality is, as I've said before, on the submarine front, we have nothing but a ripped-up deal with a French company. And as for the AUKUS deal with the US and the UK, there are no details. If it comes to anything, it could be 20 to 25 years before we get a nuclear-powered submarine, which, as Greg Sheridan says, means never. And that's why Macron, with his nose out of joint and trying to impress his electorate, was trying to appear to be defending French interests. As Peter Hartcher writes today, Macron, quote, jeered the fact that for the next 18 months, the only thing Canberra has is a committee to discuss with Washington and London how to make the decision work, unquote. Well, not for the first time, Tony Abbott seems to have the answer. Buy some retiring nuclear submarines now for training purposes to bring our expertise from nowhere up to some sort of speed, and in an emerging crisis, they could be called into operation. As things stand, all the Prime Minister has is a raft of serious insults from two world leaders from which he has to defend himself over a submarine contract that's been ripped up. He's left with nothing to replace the French deal. No dates, no details, just some newspaper headlines about an AUKUS agreement between Britain and America, which so far has delivered nothing in terms of our defence capability. From whatever standpoint you view all this, it is a damaging mess. What do you think? Email me, alan@skynews.com.au, or the text line 0414 000 848.